Well, the question was, when I was researching the book, did I have any problem finding material about Colin Wilson's early life? Well, he wrote two autobiographies. The most recent one came out in 2004, and that's called Dreaming to Some Purpose. But there was another one called Voyage to a Beginning that came out in 1969, published to no acclaim. Because at that time he was regularly being hauled over the coals by literary critics. I mean, The Outsider was the only book that got good reviews in the first part of his career, more or less. But no, there's a lot of material in Voyage to a Beginning on his early years, and he also has different sort of autobiographical sections in some of his books. His second book, A Religion and the Rebel, has a long autobiographical introduction. But he told me when he was doing the second book that nobody really is interested in, you until you're about a teenager. So he left out lots of stuff about his sort of family and all that kind of thing. But, I mean, he talks about himself here and there in lots of different places, and there's lots of interviews. And at the time, people were doing a lot of sort of digging about him. I mean, he was in the papers. He was in, the Daily Mail, the News of the World, all that kind of stuff all the time. He was in the Sunday supplements and all that sort of thing. He became famous around the same time as Elvis Presley. I mean, I think within months. James Dean had only died a couple of years earlier. So he's actually kind of in that era of like the rising kind of pop culture figure, and this kind of immediate kind of adulation. This is one of the things that worked against him, because I didn't get to it in my rambling talk. But what happened was that people got fed up with the angry young men. They were in the newspapers a lot. And they'd be in brawls and things like that, and they'd be. In many ways, it was like the punks in the 70s. Because if you read some of these interviews at the time, they're trying to get them to say something. It's kind of, oh, come on, say something outrageous. Come on. And they really came to celebrity in what's called the silly season, August, for the newspapers, where nothing's happening. Parliament's out of session. There's no political news, and so the journalists need to drum up something to get something going. And so they invented these people, the angry young men. Then they followed them around, and every time they argued, every time they had a party, every time something happened, it'd be in the papers. And so, I mean, one of the things that drove Wilson, or the thing that drove him out of London down to Cornwall, where he lived from 1957 until his death in 2013. And I went on a pilgrimage there. I start the book talking about this in 1983, was that he... his wife, well, later on wife Joy, parents, they weren't too keen on him, and they thought, she had thrown her sort of chances of, life away, hanging out with this bohemian writer who's not going to go anywhere, or anything like that. And her sister chanced upon notebooks of his, where he was doing research for this book, Ritual in the Dark, which is about a serial killer. And she thought it was his own journal. Right. So there's all these entries about whatever. And so one day they were living over in Chepstow Villa over in Notting Hill, at the time before Notting Hill became really fancy and fashionable to live in. It was a ghetto over there. And one morning, Joy's parents have arrived, and her father has a horsewhip. And he says, like, the game is up, Wilson, and all that. And don't you know he's a homosexual with 6 mistresses? And so the illogic of the remarks sort of was lost on everyone except Wilson. And there was this horrible kind of fight going on. And then at the time it was going on, they actually were entertaining this notorious character named Gerald Hamilton, who was a friend of Aleister Crowley's. But in any case, he ran out the door, got on the telephone, and called as many newspapers as he possibly could. And so while this thing's going on, all these journalists come down to Chepstow Villa and Notting Hill, and there's photographs and there's all this kind of stuff. And finally the police arrive. But Wilson is being followed by the paparazzi. He's being followed wherever he goes. They're trying to get something about him just to fill the papers. And his editor at the time said, you have to leave. You have to get out of London if you want any kind of literary career anymore. You have to get out of here, because you're just going to be a joke. And so, because of that, he hightailed it down. Well, first he went to Ireland, but he eventually wound up in Cornwall and stayed there for the rest of his life. So he was part of this, strange time where there was a lot of publicity about what he was doing, and then that all that all went south. The press turned against him completely, and especially him, because he didn't go to university, he was self-taught, and he had a perhaps unfortunate habit of talking about his genius too often. For what you're not supposed to do if you're English, you're supposed to be very humble and so on. No, he said, yes. He wasn't going on saying, I'm a genius, but he was basically saying, well, yes, of course I have to believe in myself. I've had to believe in myself for the last 10 years. How else do you think I would have survived, everything I've been through in order to become a writer? And you've just told me I was right. All of these book reviews here are saying that, yes, and it wasn't this kind of ego kind of thing. It's basically, I knew it, you've agreed with me, and let's get on and talk about that. But what had happened was no one was interested in talking about the ideas. Because, as Wilson said, and as has been confirmed to me by both Owen Barfield and Kathleen Raine, two other great English writers of ideas and sort of mystical philosophy, that the English aren't interested in ideas. They're absolutely impervious to ideas. And so Wilson was barking up the wrong tree. He was banging his head against the wrong wall. He may have had a better reception had he gone across the channel. But then again, he was arguing with Sartre and Camus. So he had no place else to go but where he went, down to Cornwall. And he just wrote. In between 1957, when he went down there, chased down by Joy Wilson's father's bullwhip, he wrote and wrote and wrote. He wrote a series of books called The Outsider Cycle that developed what he called this new existentialism. Novels, one of which is The Mind Parasites, which is a great science fiction novel that uses H.P. Lovecraft's ideas and talks about this kind of psychic vampires, which I think we're all familiar with. The Philosopher's Stone, writing books about crime, history of crime. Serial killers, he's sort of writing a lot of true crime well in advance of the mass popularity about it. And it's not until 1971 when his book The Occult comes out, which he wrote and which Watkins has published a new edition of a couple of years ago. He wrote, not on a whim, but because he needed the money. I mean, the story is that his American publisher approached him with the idea of writing a book about the occult, and the occult became very, very popular in the 60s. I've written a book called Turn Off Your Mind about the occult revival of the 1960s, and in about 1960 there was a book came out in Paris called The Morning of the Magicians, and it kind of kick-started what became this occult revival. And at the tail end of that, Wilson, who had no interest, I mean, he read books on UFOs and ghosts and stuff like that, but he wasn't writing about the occult at all. He was writing existentialism, and mysticism, and consciousness, and literature. But he was approached and asked, would you like to write a book about the occult? Because he needed the money, he did. And it was in the writing of that book that he realized that actually there's as much evidence for the reality of the occult as there is for elementary particles. Or, as I think he says, the mating habits of albino rats. There is as much evidence there for the occult and paranormal as there is for any other thing that science credits with, being evidential. But, the difference is that science is only interested in kind of hard material things, and the occult is about these inner experiences, these mental, psychical kinds of things. But in any case, this is that changed his mind doing that book. And then he becomes, in the early 70s, he's not reinvented, but he becomes this kind of very leading theorist about the paranormal and the occult. There was a show called A Step in the Dark that was, I don't know if it was down here in London, but I think it was up in, west, or out in West, whatever the BBC out there is, where he was involved in different kinds of paranormal kind of experiments and interviewing psychics and things like that. And then another book called Mysteries that came out in the late 70s. The occult was a history of the occult up until, say, the 20th century, and Mysteries was about all the stuff that had been going on since that book came out. And Watkins has published that as well.